That was.
I'm sure you all had a lovely break and that you have found your way to session 2 of SPICE in the data
We're
tracker.
real close to you up here.
We're a very, very friendly group up here, so everybody gets to be nice and close. We have 2 more documents we're going to look at, and then we'll have an AOB. Hopefully not too long an AOB, because remember, we're taking stuff to the list to make substantive decisions. But next up, we do have Ori with no hats on.
Hi, I'm Ori. I'm here to talk to you about SPICE discovery, and I'll share with you that I've been in many sessions this IETF, and I've seen each of them has each working group has their own document that has discovery in big bold letters on it. I hope that as we consider this topic in SPICE, we are paying attention to the work that's happening in those other areas and other working groups. And you'll see why in a second. That's it, next. So what is this SPICE discovery idea? So you've just seen that there's these things, they're called CrEdentials. They have some cryptography in them, that's interesting. They have a million different ways you can represent their payloads, some of them fantastically complicated, some of them very simple, some of them are available, free, and you can access the registry and you can see what all the claims mean. Others, you have to pay to access the registry to understand what the claims mean. So there's all these different credentials, but what if you're just trying to understand if a given entity supports any of this, like at all? So the idea with this discovery document is, you might start with a brand that has a well-known, like a trusted digital resource, like a domain name that they do business on. They have, maybe it's an online marketplace, maybe it's a government website. Let's say that, it's logistics.example, just for an example. So there's all kinds of different discovery mechanisms for domain names that we've seen within the IETF. And I've listed like a couple examples here. One is the simple GET request with the well-known URI scheme. I think Mark is around here somewhere sitting in the front. So thank Mark for well-known URIs and other people who've worked and commented on this topic. Yeah, sorry. Well-known URIs are a structure for discovering information from a web server. And you're welcome to interrupt me along the way as I kind of walk my way through a couple of these different examples. Another example would be the robots.txt formats, privacy TXT. You've maybe heard about people considering other formats like that in the context of like the AI control work. Like I know there's this website, I want to discover some information about it, like, understand its policy, respect it, interact with it. There's also, DNS discovery capabilities, and, some of those records can be signed, some of them are not. I'm not a DNS expert. So I'm sure many of you can tell me all of the wonderful benefits of DNSSEC, and another group can get up and explain all of the problems with it. Maybe there's something there for us. Maybe it's something we should stay away from. In terms of these discovery topics, if credentials are protected with cryptography, one of the questions we might want to answer would be what signature algorithms are supported. What types of credentials does this issuer create? What types of credentials does this verifier accept? Which issuers does this verifier recognize? So trust list sort of scenarios. Next slide, please. So this is meant to sort of just trigger you. You've got identifier, SPICE discovery happens. You learn of verification keys and capabilities and credentials. There's some listed identifiers here, and our charter actually kind of restricts us in terms of what we think about here. So some of these examples are we're not allowed to talk about them. But I put them here just to remind you that these identifiers it's not just domain names. There's there's other kinds of places where these things show up. Sometimes URLs get moved around in different places. So I think that's basically it. Next slide. So why should we provide a document that describes at least one way to do discovery? We want to basically have a way of providing assurance that's related to confirmation methods. So you heard, in the SDJOT and SDCWT use cases, you have these confirmation claims, which are about the holder key binding. And that gives you confirmation that, when a credential is presented, it's being presented from a device that the issuer, wanted that credential bound to. Well, what if you wanted to know whether that device was still trusted in a domain or was associated with some other DNS information or HTTPS information? So there's this concept of like checking the confirmation method, which is sort of like checking the status, which is also related to other work that you may be familiar with regarding status lists and status assertions. If we provide discovery mechanisms that allow you to identify digital credentials, maybe we can help search engines and bots find digital information that helps them do their jobs better or respect like legal regulation better, that kind of thing. If you're trying to do an upgrade, maybe you've heard of this quantum computer that just got created and you want to upgrade all your signature algorithms, you need to have a way of sort of signaling that you supported this algorithm, at one point, now you support these new algorithms. And discovery is a really important integration point for considering how digital credentials plug into the rest of the internet. And, is there a relationship, for example, between the discovery mechanisms that Whimsy's developing, which are fantastic, and like look at their documents, they're a little bit ahead of us, and they've already been thinking about a lot of these problems, and there's some great work there. And what parts of Whimsy's discovery systems are relevant to us, and what parts are not really appropriate for SPICE? So I don't have the answers there. I just think that we have to be paying attention to the other areas in the IETF where discovery is happening, and we need to figure out what parts of those discovery mechanisms does our charter allow us to be inspired by and work on, and what parts are kind of out of scope. Next slide. So this is a -00 draft, and I published it quite some time ago when I had much more time. And it needs to focus on URLs. Needs to focus on URIs. It probably needs to work with URLs. URNs are in here because like resolving a name is a thing that people do. And there's some connection points between this and these things at the bottom that people have been talking about at the mic, like decentralized identifiers, which are basically a kind of URN that you resolve, which is an interesting idea. If you've attended the DMBOF, if you were fortunate enough to attend that, there's folks who are kind of thinking about discovering cryptographically protected information in the DNS, whether it's a signed record of some type or it's a pointer to some other more complicated cryptographic data structure. So that's an interesting topic. And I did work on a draft that was just thinking about the confirmation claim in JWT and CWT and DNS, just those topics together. Like, what if you were discovering confirmation claims regarding holder keys in HOSI and COSI? And what if you were trying to identify if an issuer of a JWT or a CWT also had some other interesting information in the DNS? OpenID Federation is a thing I don't know anything about. There are other folks who do. I'd love to hear from them what parts of OpenID Federation are relevant to SPICE and what parts maybe don't make sense. I think Giuseppe had mentioned on the list at some point that we really ought to be considering what's happening with OpenID Federation and the digital credential discovery capabilities in that ecosystem. So I'm not an expert on that, but if you are, I'd love to hear from you how this might be related. Next slide. So it's not ready for adoption. It is barely ready to even be read. This is basically just a placeholder for all of the other discovery work that I can see other authors making tremendous, great progress on, and call to action for you all. Do we need this in SPICE? And does anyone have time to work on it? Because it's going to take a lot of effort to get this document into the shape where it can even be considered. And, you know, is this a priority, or are these other documents that you've seen discussed today actually where we should be spending our time? Because we're only gonna have like a limited amount of time to focus on things, and the folks who are going to contribute are going to have other options to contribute to in the context of SPICE. So
You've got a cue.
Please.
Justin.
Okay, just to get it out of everybody's systems, to
Name
discover.
and affiliation.
Thank you, Justin Richer. To discover SPICE, one must walk without rhythm and search for worm sign. A third of you were thinking that. Anyway, discovery is really important because of the specific role that it plays in taking an input that you have easy access to get to a bunch of data that you don't have easy access to. It's really a way to translate from one memorable thing to a bunch of other things that you don't want to remember all at once. And as such, any discovery system, as you started to go into on the previous slide, needs to be really clear about what its expected inputs are as much as it is its expected outputs. So is this something that's going to be user-facing? Is it something that's going to absolutely never be user-facing, like URLs? People are never going to see URLs. And read Temple's original docs for that. But in any case, the whole thing here is that it needs to, whatever we do with SPICE, it needs to be very clear about what gap it's filling, because I think it's going to be inevitable that there are going to be multiple discovery systems that are going to be incompatible with each other because they're dealing with different sets of circumstances. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but it's something that you have to be very eyes open about in terms of how the ecosystem is kind of built and put together, because if you discover incompatible things on different sides, what do you do? Discovery systems should be aware of something like that. Like, how do you reconcile? Because otherwise therein lies many attacks. That didn't really have a question, more of just an observation of where this could eventually fit in.
thank you.
Mike.
Or your weekend projects are always some of my favorite things to read. There are some really good thoughts, I think, in this draft. One thing I noticed is, you know, when I think about SPICE, a lot of this is I'm thinking about how are we doing some of this stuff in more of a CBOR, you know, kind of world rather than a JSON world. And there's a lot of application JSON in this draft. So I think there's seeds in here that maybe we can mull on, and then maybe craft a draft that's like, maybe that's once we start looking at CNF and some of the other properties and discovery around that, like in a SD-CWT context, that it will help us figure out, well, what properties would we want to maybe tie back into DNS and into some web discovery using CBOR, or other protocol discovery using CBOR. So that's just kind of where my mind is. But I'm very glad you wrote this stuff down, because it is common problems and patterns we see all the time. So
There's ACE and COPE, and there's a whole community of CBOR and transport experts in the IETF, and I'm not one of those folks. I can barely write EDN or CDL. So I think if we want to do that, we better have a chat with some of those folks, because they're doing this right now, and they're moving in IoT context and transport contexts. And you hit a point that I think we struggled with when we were talking about the work originally, and you heard it, you know, it's going to keep coming up. JSON versus CBOR. Why can't we be friends? Like, we have CWT claims. The CWT registry requires you to point to the JWT registry for confirmation claims. Like, these things are, there is a chance to sort of have some unity here and to be inspired and help each other, you know, make this stuff work. And a lot of the JSON discovery stuff is, you know, pretty far ahead. So, and I'm also more familiar with it. That's why that stuff's in the document. So, sorry.
Leif?
All right, Leif Johansson. So yes, definitely go. Let's go talk to Giuseppe and learn about OpenID Federation. That's a good idea, right? But and for many reasons, but one important one is that like discovery and trust establishment are two different things, and they're often very easily confused. Just because I found a key in the DNSSEC zone doesn't mean that I trust it for everything. And do you have a handle? Do you understand how somebody manages the signing keys for their DNSSEC setup? Probably don't, right? So it's easy to focus on discovery and make it very, very simple, and then like turn the discovery into a trust establishment mechanism. And that is dangerous. So I think that's one thing. That's at least it's like a meta comment. Let's try to get this right and separate these two processes out.
Awesome.
Watson?
Watson Ladd, Akamai. We've had some back and forth on the list about this, but I think I still don't understand what discovery solves. I mean, if you go to the phytosanitary convention issue, you load up in Rotterdam with a bunch of things, and then you go and load in Tanzania, and by the time you've got in there, you discover the credentials you had aren't good anymore, and they're literally baked onto the pallets you have. Do you turn around and go back? It just doesn't seem to me. It seems to be at the gap between when credentials are issued, when they're presented and verified, means you need to think about the system evolution in a more systematic way. And discovery doesn't feel to me like it's solving a problem there.
Yeah, go ahead.
So Watson, I think you're actually paraphrasing or trying to say some of the stuff that I was trying to get at, right? That trust management is and discovery should happen as part of the configuration of a system, not as part of a runtime of a system. And the kind of situation you paint, Watson, it's definitely related to that, right?
Yeah, I think I hear an echo between what you said, Watson, and Leif, what you had said. And just as one example of a thing that could change, between the issuance of a credential and its presentation, let's imagine that we were bought into the world of we need a really complicated and precise, ontology structure in our claims set payload. And we're loading some information that's regarding this structure, over the network at the time we're doing verification at some point in the future, or incrementally in the building of applications to support these credential types. And then we're shipping pre-built binaries that understand that information. So like, what happens if that information changes? It's not status update, status list, CRL stuff. It's not OCSP, validity information, but it impacts the validity processing. What do I do? Is that verified? Is that invalid? Do I reject this thing? Does the application crash? There's a lot of discovery. So coming back to your question of like, how are some of these trust and validity issues maybe related to what happens to the credential after it's issued, before it's presented? I think discovery, we have to be careful about where you put this. Like you can't be discovering something that's potentially changing and then randomly causing verifications to fail. Like that's going to be a big problem.
Justin?
Just very quick, a note for this community from experience with other protocols is that Justin Richer, by the way. Sorry, Heather. Discovery can, in some cases, lead to privacy violations because looking up where something came from and letting the thing that you're looking it up at know that you're looking up something from a certain place could leak more information than you realize. Additionally, telling something where you're from in an inherent kind of way could potentially leak more information than you realize. I don't think, I think that that's inherent in the problem space, but I think it's imperative that this community keep that really, really clear for any type of discovery system so as to not create privacy violating oracles. And I'm not looking for an answer from this draft specifically.
So it was pretty clear that the document isn't ready for a working group adoption call, but is there anyone interested in helping work on it to get to that point? If you are, appreciate if you dropped a note either in chat or talk to Ori.
Or talk to Mike.
Hey, everybody. I'm here to talk to you about identifiers for businesses. We've talked about identifiers for processes and identifiers for people. And the work that I've been doing most recently with supply chain tracing and everything has led me to think that maybe there's a need here. Conversations with a bunch of folks have confirmed that they also see maybe a need. So I wrote something, and hopefully you don't hate it. Next slide. This is an identifier. It's really useful if you know what kind of identifier it is and where to look it up and all of that. It's really useful identifier if you know the context of it. Next slide. But what is it? We'll get there. Next slide. How can we take this identifier and make it useful? We want to make it so that it exists independent, so that we can refer to it in attestations, so that we can look at it 10 years down the road and say, yes, at that time, that's what that thing was. That's what we were talking about then. That's the kind of the motivating thing here. Next slide. Next slide. Some examples. US Customs and Border Patrol has this global business identifier thing that they're doing. And they say, hey, if you want to import things in the United States, it would be really helpful if you told us either, well, the GLN from GS1 or your DUNS number, or there's this thing that Glyph has called an LEI. Tell us one of those things. That's your GBI. Except GBI is not actually a thing. It's one of these things. So that's helpful. There's like, even the people who are like, we want to use these are kind of confused about what they're doing, which is fine. But next slide. Additionally, when we are mapping out supply chains, it's really easy to say, well, company one in industry A has tier one supplier F, but if we can't point to exactly the entity that we're talking about, if we're trying to do fuzzy logic mapping on names or even name address combinations, we're going to be pointing to the wrong thing. And we're going to be making attestations about the wrong entity. And sometimes those attestations have significant business consequences, because some of the attestations that I'm personally involved with discovering are that company's doing bad things by forcing people to work for them without paying them, otherwise known as slavery. Bad things. And if we're pointing at the wrong thing, that can have severe consequences. We don't want to point at the wrong thing. Next slide. Additionally, people talk about companies all the time. When I go to X as a company and say, I want to be verified, I want to be the verified official company that is this thing, how many Mike's warehouses are there in the world, and how many of them can be verified on X as the Mike's warehouse? I don't know, probably a lot. There's the potential for this to be useful, it seems to me. This way to have an unambiguous identifier that carries with it the context through which you can learn more about the entity that is identified. Next slide. So the idea is really, really basic. And it was so basic that for a while I was like, does this even need to be written down? And I thought, Yeah, probably. So next slide. Here it is. It's a URI. It says glue. And there's an IANA registry that has a bunch of authority identifiers that says this is the scheme that you use for this identifier. And the identifier, that's the identifier that was assigned by the external authority. That's it. That's the idea. It's pretty straightforward, but it seems like it might be useful. So now this number that we're like, hey, it's a number. Well, now I know it's a number that was assigned by the United States IRS. It's an entity identification number, or an enterprise, it's an EIN. Employer identification number. I got the wrong E all week. But there it is. But see, if I was able to go to the IANA registry and look it up, I could find out that it's an employer identification number. I wouldn't have to guess. Next slide.
Do you want to take a question?
I would love to take questions. I like questions.
Well, AJ jumped in front of you while you were thinking about it.
How was that even possible? How did I jump in front of Hank?
I shot this lowered my
You
hand.
can go first. I was shocked.
So this is just a clarifying question. Why are pens not enough? IANA has pens. They are enterprise numbers. They look like globally unique enterprise numbers. So you just said employees. So just elaborate on that use case. So why there's a gap.
Roy's coming to the mic.
Roy Williams, Microsoft, because the way customs and global trade want to do this is all the way down to raw materials, and a lot of those small suppliers do not have computers and they do not have a US entity. So this scheme is to allow flexibility worldwide, not limited to one.
Thanks, Roy.
Okay.
So, but I have to
Yeah,
respond to that.
I kind of want to keep with Q, but go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Globally uniqueness typically requires an authority of very large things, and also you can. So the threshold here is the registration at IANA. So if you can't register the IANA, you need something else. Otherwise, if that's not the threshold, then globally uniqueness needs an authority.
You just have to look at the website from, this is Roy Williams, from DHS. IANA was not listed as a member of the GBI, and the government's dictating the source and authorities of the numbers based on these companies are doing review and issuing a number for them. Unfortunately, government does not recognize IANA as a member of the GBI.
Okay.
Thanks, Roy.
AJ?
So many tabs. I apologize. What is the scope of the enumerating list of different identifiers that people are going to use? Is it just the list that's currently in the glue draft? Are there more?
I mean, Mike Perrock is coming to the mic to answer that.
I am queued, and I specifically
Go for it, Mike.
question as well as the prior one. So currently, we're tracking over 250 million unique businesses as parent entities, right? This is not counting subsidiaries and all the other fun things going on. And that's just currently active. Additionally, we get into scenarios where each jurisdiction sometimes requires different identifiers for different purposes. So a very good example is that US Gov, if you were contracted with them prior, used to utilize DUNS, right, as a really common way of identifying who you are. They now have a UEI that actually is pinned that's a little bit separate, and those things tend to change over time. It doesn't invalidate your DUNS number, though, right? Our company still has a DUNS number. We have a UEI, we have a cage code, we have a separate entity number assigned in each jurisdiction with which we're registered to do business. And here's the interesting thing is that when we're dealing with regs or data that can deal with regulatory data, a lot of times you actually have to reference the exact subsidiary or the exact location of a subsidiary. Some things deal with that, like GLN, and other things don't. And so having that ability to go account for these different identifier systems, to go look up where the registration is, what the meaning is, and then reference that unique entity as described in that jurisdiction or that registry system turns out to be a really important property. Does that help answer your question, AJ?
Yes. Okay. One of the other things I'm worried about is that, like, in certain domains, I don't know the full scope. I mean, I did some typo nitpicking to pretend to be helpful to Brent before. That wasn't really helpful. So I have some questions that I haven't read it in a bit. I don't know the scope of where these identifiers can be used, but for instance, in the U.S. government, for public health care, everyone's favorite part of public health care is the accounting arm. So that's the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services. There are taxpayer identifiers that are used for billing for, like, medical providers. Almost all those taxpayer identifiers are not sensitive, except if you're dealing with sole proprietors. There are doctors that are basically their own business, and then it's a social security number. So you can't, those are toxic. You can't share those anywhere in government. And then anytime one of those is accidentally copy and pasted, it would cause an incident for government contractors. So maybe I'm saying, like, I would probably want to see more of these things, like a bigger enumeration of what you're talking about. I guess there needs to be some privacy considerations, but I don't see how you can have, with the current structure, just talking about this, unless you layer it some way with some other part of Spice or something else, identifiers that are kind of important, but you can't really share with everybody else. I don't know if that really something can solve in the privacy considerations, but I can open up an issue in the GitHub and try to, like, talk through this. But that's about identifiers I know about that are used in different domains that are not the ones that are currently slated, but probably will come up for other use cases on identifying legal entities that are really individuals and cause privacy concerns. And there are actually a few of them in government that I know of. I'm sure I'm not the expert here.
Yeah, please do raise that issue. That's part of the conversation that we're hoping to raise here. Like,
All right, cool.
yeah.
I also don't really understand how the nested organizations work and how you say, I'm confident that a subsidiary is related to someone. Like, Roy and I have talked about this in other domains before. I'm curious how that can be ameliorated through work like this. Like, how can you say, I'm asserting I'm confident I am who I say I am, or someone says, I think this person at 80% confidence is a subsidiary of this person, but I'm not sure. We presume that it's always a correct answer, and I don't know if there is all the time when you're not the person attesting to the fact that you are. That's the end of that one. Sorry for cutting.
Oh, no worries. So two things on that. This draft is literally just describing this string. It's a building block. We imagine uses for it. We believe that it will be very useful in, making attestations about companies. There are obviously factors that we need to consider, like the privacy concerns. But mostly the uses to which this identifier can be put, we're thinking that's the next layer. Like, once this identifier exists, then we can start using it. But I do talk about that a little bit, but it looks like Roy's at the mic too.
Roy Williams. The way I think of this is slightly different, which is in the case of shipping for physical products, they want to know the factory, and from the stitching we have to do for ownership, it's back to the corporate identity. So we kind of need some identity mechanism for corporate, and then issue factory identity based off the previous one to walk it back. This is, in this case, how it would be established. And then the numbers are specific to the identities because of the location-specific information for LEI, and that's where CBP really wants to know where the product is coming from.
Yeah, and where I imagine the attestations will come from, I think at first, it may be, one company is pointing to a different one saying, this is the one I'm talking about. I can imagine in the future, GS1 could issue a credential that says that the company that is in possession of this credential is the one I'm talking about. We issue this identifier as part of an attestation that they can then bear to verifiers.
Your Honor, Sheffield, two quick comments. One is I'm almost sure that you want to add a level of country code to the URN. And second, so I work for Intuit. We have a large number of small business customers, and I can envision my own company wanting to mint this kind of identities for small businesses. Is that something that you have in mind, like just arbitrary organizations creating these identities, or is it only about government identities?
So the examples that I threw into the doc are like the DUNS, the LAI, the GALN. So it's, you know, well-known organizations that have a business of identifying businesses. Those are the ones that we thought of at first as, you know, that would fit well with this scheme. But if anybody, like if NeoFlow, for example, wanted to stand themselves up as an identifier of oil companies, then they would be in a position of authority to do so. And people who know oil companies would be like, oh, NeoFlow, we trust them to do this identification. And so the goal of the registry is more, here's the list of possibilities for people to look at, not to, we don't want to pick favorites or anything. There will be different contexts in which different values will be more apt.
Makes sense.
All right, so I do have a question as chair, and that is, how do you see this fitting in SPICE scope?
So we in SPICE are talking about credentials, and credentials are about things, and many of the things that we want to talk about, at least from people that I've worked with, are companies, and we don't have a unified way of referring to them. And so that's kind of where I was imagining this would fit SPICE-wise.
Brent, there's another. Roy Williams, Microsoft. I also don't want GS1 and LEI to become identity providers of certificates. I would rather than make claims as GS1 that here's your number, and allow other systems to be the identity providers, and they bolt on information either as a claim or a counter signature or something. And that's why this is important information.
Yeah.
There's 2 more slides.
2 more. Are we out of slide? We're out of time. Okay. So as an example, don't go back there. That one was good. So as an example, the difficulties of fuzzy name matching, if I said, hey, the Internet Society, they're awesome. Well, which Internet Society is awesome? Is it the Internet Society chapter of the Greater New York City metro area? Or is it the Internet Society ISOC Illinois chapter? Or do I mean the grandfather of them all, the Internet Society, by which I can refer to 54-1650477 if I have this identifier? It's a way of being exact. Next slide. To sum up, we want a glue ID so that we have a representation format that adds the explicit authority context to the business identifier, so that the identifier bears with it the information that you need to figure out what the heck it means. And that's pretty much it. Yeah, like in scope, we want to register a scheme. We want to have ways of including authorities in the registry. We don't want to be super picky about what those authorities are at this stage. Like, you are a naming authority, awesome, you're in the registry. It's just an identifier at this point. We don't have any binding to keys. We don't have any authentication of the claimed identifier built into it. It's just an identifier at this point. But we can imagine those use cases being built on top of it in clever and well-reasoned ways.
Okay. So we spent a bit of time on this one. So we closed the queue just to try and keep things under control. I do see that there have been a couple more questions, but I wonder, in terms of next steps, I don't think it's ready for a working group adoption call, but it certainly may be for people who are interested. I think reaching out to Brent would be a really good idea to polish this up and bring it back.
Yeah, it's definitely ready for people to read it and poke holes at it and tell us the things that you would rather see different. So please do. And thanks to Pam for making these slides for me.
And that brings us to AOB. And I'm hitting, hit that button and hit that button. Okay. Stuart.
Keep it quick. I know it's not in the charter as one of the other working groups to coordinate with, but just want to remind everybody that we're having a happy time creating identifiers of our own over in the drone remote identification protocol working group. Everybody's got an identifier. We got a shiny identifier.
All right. Anyone else? Bueller? Bueller? All right, so we've got some homework and we have dinner plans. So with that, I do look forward to probably chatting with you guys on Slack, and we've got a few things we want to talk about on the list. I didn't ask for a note taker. I'm actually going to go back in for my own edification and polish these up into notes and get them in a few days. So thank you all for coming to the first SPICE working group, and safe travels for wherever you may go next. Bye. All right. Okay. Okay. Then you may catch up. Otherwise, we'll see you there.
It sounds like it's kind of a conflict with kind of credentials or something else. It should be still compatible with internal.
Should be. It's still early to figure that out, but yes.
Yeah, I mean, as long as there's
Yep. Yep. Cool. Emotional support cow. Also, it's the name of my company. Right. Squish.